On Thursday, voters in Clacton will elect their Member of Parliament. Normally, that'd be straightforward, except the man most likely to win is Nigel Farage. And Nigel Farage was the MP for Clacton until he voluntarily resigned last month. He then immediately announced that he wanted the job back. So Clacton is holding a by-election because its MP resigned in order to fight a by-election for the seat he had just resigned from. British politics has produced stranger sentences, but not many. Farage says he wants the people of Clacton to judge him after weeks of scrutiny over his finances. His opponents call the whole thing a stunt. Labour and the Conservatives are not standing. 34 candidates are on the ballot, the UK parliamentary record. And the candidate polling in second place is Count Binface. Behind the absurdity is a serious political gamble. Why did Farage trigger his own by-election? And what would actually count as victory? Farage finally entered the House of Commons at the 2024 general election. He won Clacton with 46.2% of the vote. The Conservatives finished second on 27.9% and Labour third on 16.2%. That victory mattered beyond one Essex constituency. Farage had spent decades influencing British politics from outside Westminster. Clacton finally gave him a seat inside it. Then, on the 7th of July 2026, he resigned. Not retired, not left politics, resigned so that he could stand again. Farage said the people of Clacton should judge his actions and described the contest as the people against the establishment. The vote takes place on the 13th of August. This is not a normal by-election. Farage has faced scrutiny over gifts and financial support from wealthy backers. Parliament's standards watchdog has been investigating questions surrounding a £5 million personal gift from cryptocurrency investor Christopher Harborne. There has also been scrutiny of separate financial support linked to a former aide. At the time of this script, these are investigations and allegations. They are not findings that Farage committed wrongdoing. Farage and Reform defend his conduct. He argues that the scrutiny has become an establishment campaign to discredit him. Critics argue that an elected politician should answer detailed questions about financial interests without turning the process into a popularity contest. That disagreement explains the logic of the by-election. Farage is trying to move the arena. Instead of the story being decided by headlines, standards, procedures, and political opponents, he wants the electorate that chose him in 2024 to deliver another verdict. Resigning a parliamentary seat voluntarily sounds risky for one obvious reason. Elections can be lost. But Farage has reasons to believe Clacton is favourable territory. He won comfortably in 2024. Reform has a strong local base, and after his resignation, the major national parties made an unusual decision. Labour and the Conservatives said they would not contest the seat. The Liberal Democrats and Greens are also absent from the final ballot. That transformed the election. Instead of a conventional contest between major parties, Clacton became something close to a referendum of Farage, surrounded by 33 alternatives. For Farage, the opportunity is obvious. Win comfortably and he can say, I asked the voters, they backed me. For his opponents, the absence of the main parties makes that claim easier to challenge. They can argue that voters were never offered a normal parliamentary contest. Both sides therefore have different definitions of what the result will mean. And then something very British happened. Everybody else decided to stand. 34 candidates have been formally nominated. Tendring District Council says that this is a record for a UK parliamentary election. The previous record was 26 at the 2008 Halton Price and Howden by-election. The ballot includes independents, smaller parties, Lawrence Fox for Reclaim, 3 candidates from the official monster raving Glooney Party, and Count Binface. At some point, a returning officer presumably looked at the paperwork and quietly reconsidered every career decision that had brought them there. The comic candidates make the election look ridiculous, but satire can perform a serious political function. It gives voters a way to register dissatisfaction with the available choices. And because the mainstream opposition parties have removed themselves from the ballot, Count Binface has become the most visible vessel for an anti Farage protest vote. A surveyation poll of 502 Clacton adults conducted between the 16th and 24th of July suggests Farage is still overwhelmingly likely to win. Among likely voters with undecided to removed, Farage was on 73%. Count Binface was second on 20, Lawrence Fox was on 2. The remaining candidates shared about 5%. Even in a forced two-way choice between Farage and Binface, Farage led 69 to 31. So this does not currently look close, but the most interesting numbers are not necessarily the voting intention. Surveyation asked voters what they thought the by-election was actually about. 45% spontaneously talked about Farage personally, his motives, conduct, or political standing. Only 12% raised something specifically about Clacton, and only 5% gave local issues as their main answer. That is remarkable. A parliamentary election exists to choose somebody to represent a place, but many voters see this contest mainly as a judgment on one national political figure. Awareness of the £5 million story is high too. Surveyation found 81% had heard at least something about it, but voters were divided over its meaning. 35% said Farage had acted within the rules, 25% thought he had acted wrongfully. Nearly a third did not know. The controversy also produced little net change in voting intention because it pushed supporters and opponents in opposite directions. In other words, it may have changed the temperature more than the likely result. Constitutionally, winning is simple. Get more votes than anyone else. Politically, Farage has set himself a higher test. He deliberately resigned so voters could judge him. That means turnout, vote share, and the size of the protest vote will all become part of the argument. A huge victory with strong turnout lets Farage claim a renewed personal mandate. A win on very low turnout still returns him to Parliament, but opponents would question how much wider meaning can be attached to it. A surprisingly large vote for Count Binface would be awkward too. Not because Britain is about to be governed from the planet Sigma 9, probably, but because a satirical candidate taking a substantial share would show how many voters used the contest to reject the premise Farage created. Reform's strength is closely connected to Farage personally. He attracts attention, dominates coverage, and communicates with voters in a way few British politicians can match. That is an asset. It can also become a weakness. A durable political party eventually has to become bigger than its leader. It needs candidates, local organisations, and voters who would support it even when its most famous figure is not on the ballot. Clacton cannot answer all of that. Because the main parties are not standing, it is also a poor election from which to make national predictions. A Farage landslide would not mean Reform is about to win a general election. A weaker than expected result would not mean Reform is finished. But because Farage chose this test himself, the verdict will matter politically. There is a genuine argument about accountability underneath all of this. Farage's case is that voters are the highest authority in a democracy. If questions have been raised about him, let his constituents decide whether they still trust him. That is a powerful argument. But elections and standards investigations answer different questions. An election asks who voters want to represent them. A parliamentary investigation asks whether particular rules or disclosure requirements were followed. Winning an election does not automatically answer a technical standards question. Losing one would not prove wrongdoing either. That distinction matters. Voters decide who represents them. Institutions decide whether institutional rules were followed. A functioning democracy needs both. So, why did Nigel Farage trigger his own by-election? Because he wants to turn a controversy about his finances and conduct into a question of democratic legitimacy. Instead of allowing standards investigations and hostile headlines to define the story, he has asked the voters who elected him to judge him again. Electorally, the gamble looks favourable. The main parties have stepped aside. The constitutional poll gives him a huge lead. His 2024 Reform voters appear highly loyal. But the election still matters. Turnout matters. The size of Farage's vote matters. The size of the protest vote matters, and the result cannot resolve every question Farage wants it to resolve. Clacton can decide whether Nigel Farage should be its MP. It cannot decide by itself whether parliamentary rules were followed. Those are different verdicts. And on Thursday, Britain may discover that a by election with 34 candidates, 3 monster raving loonies, and a man wearing a bin on his head can still tell us something serious about democratic accountability. British politics, ladies and gentlemen. But Clacton raises a bigger question than whether Farage wants his seat back. Can reform turn Farage's personal popularity into an organisation capable of replacing the Conservatives as the main force on the British right? That is a future politics brief. This has been the Nelson Brief, the context behind the story.